Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on understanding and managing flood risk uncertainty. I'm Matt Jones. I'm the Chief Products Officer here at Fathom, and I'll be your moderator. The topic of today's webinar is one that really interests me. I spent a good portion of my career at the Zurich Insurance Group as their global head of catastrophe management. And during that time, uncertainty was a topic that often dominated discussions across pretty much every aspect of the business. So uncertainty is a fundamental principle of insurance. It's the reason a number of us have had jobs in the industry. Without uncertainty, there's no insurance. But assessing how we can use models and data, given the uncertainty in these tools, was a really important topic during pretty much the whole of my career, and actually, especially during my whole time at Zurich. And indeed, these discussions resulted in us establishing the concept of a Zurich view of risk back in the 2000s. Now, sitting here saying that now, this seems blindingly obvious that a company should have their own view of risk. But back then, models were often used as is. The concept of an own view of risk wasn't a common one. This is pre-Solvency II. And of course, key to establishing a view of risk is understanding just how much weight to give the models and the data, understanding the scope and the weaknesses of models and data. And I've worked with lots of different data vendors and model vendors in my time. I've always much preferred working with vendors that are open and transparent, because this builds trust, it builds confidence, it helps us understand the strengths and weaknesses of the models, the uncertainty that might be in them. Now, it's been a while since I've worked in an insurance firm, during my time after Zurich as a consultant, and then after that at NASDAQ. And indeed, more never now in my time at Fathom, the topic of uncertainty keeps coming up time and time again in conversations with customers. And we'll soon be hearing from some experts in the industry who have kindly agreed to share their own experiences around uncertainty. But before we do that, I want to mention something that I think is quite relevant to the discussion today. It's actually a new resource that the team at Fathom think might begin to close some of the gaps in understanding the uncertainty and reliability of the data and the methods that underpin our maps and models. This is something we're calling metadata. So metadata is an extension to our global flood map. It's an additional set of information based on quantitative and qualitative assessments of uncertainty by our developers, the Fathom developers, for any location globally. And we've released this because while our global flood map helps people understand just how risky a particular location is, it doesn't really represent by itself just how much uncertainty is associated with our estimate of flood depths or risk or whatever. So we've set out to help solve that with metadata, which we think is something quite unique and different. And what we've done is systematically review all the main sources of uncertainty in producing flood maps. For each source of uncertainty, we've categorized them into something we're calling certainty ranks, which is a 1 to 10 score. And for each peril, we look at 6 different factors, and we also produce an overall certainty rank at peril level and overall flood level. And what this means, which is why it's relevant to today's discussion, it means that if you're using a flood map in conjunction with metadata, you've got another dimension in your decision making. It's not just how risky is this location from the point of view of flood, but it's also how certain am I about the estimate of risk at this location. So it gives you that extra dimension, which we think can be quite useful. So I'll not go into any more detail about that today. That's not why we're here. But if you are interested and want to find out more about metadata, I'll be doing a product briefing webinar, just a short 20-minute webinar on March 7th. So please do sign up for that. My colleague Anna will share a link for that in the chat section. So that's the adverts aside. It's my pleasure now to bring our panel in. So joining us, we have Tom Philp, CEO and founder of Maximum Information. We have Rob Porter, head of products from Vave, and we have Fathom's own chief research officer, Oliver Wing. And I think we're actually very lucky to have such a panel with us today. I've known Tom and Rob and Ollie for a number of years now. They're great people. They all have this fantastic combination of deep knowledge and intelligence combined with practical experience and a level of pragmatism. And I've certainly learned a lot from them all over the years. So I'm going to ask the panel one by one to introduce themselves now, starting with you, please, Tom.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, great to be here. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Those that don't know me, I am CEO of MaxInfo. We're an independent cat risk intelligence provider. Background in hurricane and extratropical cyclone research before joining the industry about 10 years ago and becoming obsessed with the topic of uncertainty and decision-making off the back of it, really. So, yeah, nice to be here.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Rob.
Hey, yeah, great to be here as well with you guys. So I'm a director at Vave, and I helped co-found Vave 5 years ago. We're a US property MGA focused on cat exposed risks. And really our USP is around using data in a better way and automation. My responsibilities are for pricing and risk selection. Prior to that, I worked at Canopius as head of cat research for a number of years. And then in the dim and distant past, I did kind of hydrology and hydraulic modeling in the engineering sector. And so I have some relevant experience there as well.
Great, thanks, Rob. Ollie.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are. I'm the Chief Research Officer at Fathom, background in flood modeling, unsurprisingly, I suppose. But my position gives me a pretty unique perspective, I guess, on the design, development, and use of Fathom's products, both today and the products we want to be building in the future. And a key part of that is how can we resolve more and more stuff so that we can better understand, represent, draw down uncertainties. So really excited to kick off the discussion today.
Great, thanks, Ollie. So the focus of this webinar is uncertainty in flood modelling. But before we get into the topic of flood specifically, let's just set the context and think a bit more broadly about uncertainty. So why are we even concerned about uncertainty? What are the main categories of uncertainty? What are some helpful ways that we can think about uncertainty? Could you start us with that one, please, Tom?
Yeah, sure. I guess the why, obviously, Matt, you hinted very strongly in your intro. So I mean, it's our bread and butter, right? Without uncertainty, there's no use case for insurance. Everything's predicated on it. So it should be the fundamental, I think. It's interesting to have joined the industry and as you were hinting, Matt, see people in some senses just shy away from it, right? We obviously know that the uncertainty, particularly in this catastrophe risk and natural peril space, is just so large and potentially overwhelming that I think it has led to people shying away from it. But I think the initiatives like your own and even this panel show a number of people I can see online here show that the attitude towards that is certainly changing. So I mean, understanding uncertainty, I would say, is actually the thing that has the potential to make money for insurers. So it's actually the fundamentals. That's the easy why. What are the main categories, right, is a really interesting one. The more and more I think about this, the more I'm reluctant to talk about it. I think, I left AXA XL 3 years ago and started my own company. And my second hire, obviously, people that know me will know, I hired a chief uncertainty officer, right? I haven't yet seen that around again yet. Hopefully it'll increase. But it is the thing that we need to get better at communicating with. And when I originally hired, this is Valentina Noaco, our chief uncertainty officer from Bristol Uni, she I think was guilty of trying to educate people about these things like aleatoric and epistemic and Knightian types uncertainty and thinking about things in a structured way. And it was Valentina that actually pulled me back and ultimately informed me, well, I don't think we should be thinking about this and communicating like this. Ultimately, I'm not sure it matters, right, what the source of uncertainty is. It's much more, given how extensive it is across the world we operate in, I think it's much more important to think of the use case and the decision you're trying to make before you even think about categorizing, and not putting labels on it really is possibly the most important. It's almost unnecessary. It might have to come into some actual testing at some point, but I think it's much easier for a user to just think about the decision they're trying to make. If I can really unpick that a little bit, I can give two use cases, right? So if I'm thinking from an exposure manager's perspective in the market, what I think one of my key concerns about managing uncertainty is driving down the magnitude of uncertainty in my catastrophe model output so that I know that I'm managing volatility on my exposures appropriately. Ultimately, then therefore it doesn't really I don't really need to know the sources and the types of uncertainty. I just need to know where I can drive down that uncertainty, right? In flood models, and I'm sure Ollie and Rob will get into this in time, but a major source for insurers is geolocation information, right? But it could be any other type of exposure information. So understanding the relativities of uncertainty, and ultimately how much sensitivity there is to each of these different sources of it in model output, can actually allow you to make strategic decisions on where you should be investing as a company to drive down the uncertainty. So that's one perspective that I don't think it needs categories, but you almost just need to know how to define your question. But so, if you think about it then from a portfolio manager, a seeded potentially perspective, I think it's you're not necessarily interested in driving down the uncertainty, but you certainly are interested in relative uncertainty and the stability potentially, say, of the hazard set, and understanding whether a certain region, after a number of simulations might just be more stable, or just the fact that we've had many events, say if we're taking the hurricane side, moving away from flood, in Miami compared to West Florida or the Northeast. Potentially there's a lot more uncertainty just fundamentally in the underlying data. So it's I think rather than categorizing right off the bat, it's important to understand the question that you're trying to answer first, and then formulate your uncertainty analysis around it. And I suppose in some ways I'm avoidant of talking about categories at all, Matt. Appreciate many people may disagree with me, but spend too much time theoretically in my own head, I suppose. So yeah, by being trying to be pragmatic, I move away from it. I'm interested to hear other people's thoughts on that there.
So focus on the use case and the user rather than the category would be your advice.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think I've always found those the kind of theoretical descriptions about uncertainty not that helpful in a practical setting, and I think it certainly scares people off. I think part of what we need to do and want to do is to reach out to people who don't necessarily have a CAP modeling background or an uncertainty background, and try and kind of bring them into the conversation and make them aware that with kind of CAP models, the level of uncertainty and output, and the level of uncertainty and how it differs depending on your use case. And I think if we're kind of wedded to these kind of theoretical labels, which I'm never sure that helpful, we kind of lose people quite quickly, I think. So I think there's definitely, it'd be interesting to kind of, as we go through this conversation, to talk about that communication piece of uncertainty, because I think that's one of the really important bits, and one of the bits where we kind of have a bit of a breakdown sometimes, both in terms of kind of overstating uncertainty sometimes and scaring people off, and then also the opposite, understating uncertainty and people kind of getting too wedded to CAP model outputs. So I think I definitely agree with Tom. I think it's worth thinking about it the opposite way around, I think, and kind of almost putting the theory last.
Great, thanks, Rob. Ollie, anything to add?
Yeah, I think this kind of concept of, I mean, we already have the concept of materiality when it comes to peril regions, right? What about materiality when it comes to uncertainty? When does it actually matter that you make this appraisal? Some decisions, some job roles, are solely designed about averaging out of that uncertainty. You think what an underwriter needs to do? Do they need to understand every aspect of uncertainty when you just need a price at the end of the day, versus somebody who's managing capital allocation from the exposure management side? So there's very different cases where you need to be thinking about it and when you don't. But I totally agree that the compartmentalization problem makes it quite an easy thing to ignore. If you start putting different elements of uncertainty into different boxes, you can just start to hide them away and justify it to yourself that that's okay. But we need to already accept that we are already consuming uncertain information. Even just a flood map with a return period is consuming uncertain information. It's variability about the event that could happen at a given point in space and time. And if you're calculating an average annual loss from it, you're averaging out that uncertainty. So you're already dealing with that. So there's no reason to be any more afraid of other types of uncertainty and starting to appraise that in those decisions so that they're more robust than what you're already doing. So there is really a perception shift needed when it comes to even talking about what can often be quite a dirty word, when in reality it's how this business operates.
Thanks, Ollie. So let's move into focus a little bit more now, specifically on flood. So what are the dominant sources of uncertainty in flood risk assessment, and how how does this compare to other perils? Rob, can you start us off with that, please?
Yeah, sure. So I think thinking kind of initially about frequency of flooding, flood is almost I think unique in terms of kind of level of location level uncertainty that exists because of the kind of high hazard gradient. So over a really short distance, you can get very large differences in frequency, depth, and duration of flooding. And a lot of that is to do with the sensitivity of flood risk to elevation. And so even if we're confident about our elevation at a particular location, which, you know, in the case of the US where they've writes its business, we often can be because of things like LiDAR. Even if we're kind of confident in the elevation, if you're uncertain in terms of your hydrology or in terms of kind of other model inputs, that's kind of amplified by the sensitivity of flooding to kind of elevation data. And if you kind of compare that to other perils, then if we think about kind of earthquake or hurricane, the hazard gradient for the kind of key hazard metrics there, so kind of ground motion or wind speed, tend to vary over kind of tens of kilometers kind of scale. And so there's a lot less kind of spatial variation in terms of kind of the hazard that you're looking at. Whereas with flood, you know, we're typically looking at kind of variation in hazard over kind of, it's typically kind of measured over kind of meters or tens of meters. So that definitely presents a real challenge, and kind of, Tom kind of mentioned, understanding exactly where your location is one aspect of that. I think that's compounded to a certain extent by, to a large extent by other factors which are kind of almost uniquely flood based as well. So, kind of what is a flood, and what is it that makes it into your event set? In terms of kind of both the source of flooding, so, you know, is your model fluvial or pluvial? Does it include dam breaks? Does it include kind of lake flooding? But also in terms of kind of the scale and resolution of the events that you're including, kind of what level are you going down to? So I think there's with kind of earthquake and windstorm, which I've kind of used as a comparison, I think it's generally kind of much easier to kind of delineate what's included in your flood model, included in your kind of CAT model than it is for flood. And I think that the second kind of compounding factor is the ability of humans to influence frequency. And again, this is kind of almost uniquely kind of flood based as well. So you can really kind of engineer down your frequency at a location level through various mitigations by kind of elevating your property and things like that, which kind of can make kind of which can add lots of uncertainty as well. And then also kind of a regional level through things like flood defense, which you can kind of reduce your frequency as well, but also add in kind of a human induced component to the risk of flooding with complexities around kind of overtopping and breaching and things like that. So it's in many ways the uncertainty that exists at a location level for flood risk is I think uniquely high, and that presents challenges. Certainly looking at it from kind of an underwriting point of view. So you can have two locations which have got the same AAL, but the range of uncertainty that kind of exists around them can be hugely different. And I think that's certainly an area where kind of the developments you talked around with metadata kind of could prove to be really useful, I think.
Great, thanks, Rob. Ollie.
Yeah, I mean, what Rob alludes to there, flood is barely a physical peril ultimately. If it was fully physical, we'd have a very easy job, right? If the Earth's surface was completely natural and unmodified, and all we needed to do was represent natural processes, everybody's job would be a lot easier. But the reality is the built environment modulates the hazard signal. So the built environment is not only important for, you know, understanding where your exposures are, but it actually impacts the hazard intensity itself. You know, where we decide to build flood defenses, where we decide to build cities, where we dam rivers, where we change the land use, all of these things impact flooding. And it's really that drives the uncertainty over other types of perils, which I'm not going to claim to be an expert in, where you know, a lot more of the relevant processes are Porter scale and atmospheric and fully physical, unlike this sort of built environment problem. So that's really where, you know, this difficulty with flooding comes from, because you need not only physical data, and in fact, maybe the physical data is secondary to all of that built environment data that you need to be able to properly represent the flooding. And, you know, that alludes to the biggest source of uncertainty, I think. I mean, you can sort of pick any you like and justify it, but flood defenses are a huge one ultimately. You know, my little sidetrack here is sort of what's important when it comes to uncertainty. Uncertainty on of itself is not necessarily a problem, but bias is the problem ultimately. And the unfortunate reality is we're pretty uncertain about what the bias is, and nothing induces bias quite like flood defenses do. You know, whether you decide that entire areas of a city are completely defended from a flood of a certain frequency, as they might be given some engineering structure being put in place, or whether you don't have that information, so you do nothing, or you don't have that information, you make some assumption, can lead to just absolutely enormous bias in your model. And so I think that's what leads to some of the difficulties in applying flood models. Ultimately, is you have do all the fancy physical modeling you like, and then something like not knowing where a flood defense is the difference between a usable and an unusable model, no matter how sophisticated everything else in your model cascade is. And another key one, of course, is terrain data, and again, confounded by the built environment. Most models, and in fact, every model that I know of on the market that operates at this scale, is deliberately getting rid of any of the built environment from the terrain data. You know, you can't really build flood models at large scales where you've got buildings stitched into the elevation data. The representation of the model is such that you need to remove those and have a natural kind of terrain surface to model the floods over, unless you're getting into, you know, meter scale urban modeling. That's just how it works. And we know that buildings can modulate the impact of flow, but we're deliberately removing them. And those algorithms for removing buildings and trees and other confounding factors that make two-dimensional hydraulic modeling very hard adds to the uncertainty ultimately. So those are the two big ones really, and as Rob said, pretty unique from a flood point of view.
Thanks very much, Ollie. In terms of resolution, which is always an interesting question. I mean, high resolution flood maps nearly always look better, and they certainly tick a box. But have you got a view on that? Is it, in terms of uncertainty, do they help or not?
Well, I definitely have a view on it for sure. I mean, it kind of brings the question, the much broader question than resolution, which is, you know, how do or how should vendors kind of compete when you're selling uncertain information? You know, if one represents more uncertainty and gives you a more uncertain answer, would an end user think that that's a less desirable model than one that gives you a potentially falsely precise one where the uncertainty bounds are quite narrow? What as an end user do you prefer in that case? And, you know, grid resolution is one example of that. There is certainly a feeling in the market, in the industry at the minute, that there's this fixation on minutiae when it comes to differentiating one model from another. Everybody's got an uncertain model, so how do I find that edge to say that mine's less uncertain or more useful or whatever it might be? And this is part of the same problem, right? Grid resolution becomes, you know, a falsely precise way of differentiating a model. Sure, you get a prettier picture at the end, but are you actually reducing uncertainty by increasing the grid scale? Maybe in some cases, maybe where other bits of how you're building the model support you simulating at that resolution. But do you think there's any uncertainty, or more importantly, any bias that you're getting rid of simply by increasing the grid scale? And you know, I don't think, and indeed can evidence that that is really not where your fixation should be. But does it visually look as appealing? Is it sort of conceptually on the model specification as cool to just say, hey, we're simulating at a resolution consistent with the fidelity of the other components, and we're giving a richer appraisal of uncertainty? Maybe that isn't sexy enough, but ultimately that should be the direction we're heading in.
Thanks, Ollie. Tom, have you got anything to add to this question of dominant sources of uncertainty in flood risk assessment?
Definitely not compared to these guys. They wouldn't dare. But no, I think one of the things that was just appearing in my mind, because I obviously agree very strongly with the sentiments they have, but it's interesting what they were saying ultimately, you know, about flood being this built environment impact. And in one of the if you then sort of collate what we were saying in your first question, Matt, about decision makers. One of the things that obviously people are so focused on reporting at the moment is, climate change impacts on flood, just because we know how impactful a warming climate is on background precipitation, right? That drives flooding. And one of the things that really occupies my time at the moment is trying to help people answer the question for different perils. And Rob obviously brought up this like more continuous risk view you can get with, say, more macro scales and more macro perils like hurricane, where it's less discontinuous to try and understand the risk at any single location. But one of the things that I really struggle with is helping people actually for like flood. Wildfire is very similar, right? Where we can, take fuel out of the built environment and almost mitigate the risk of wildfire entirely. How you really effectively allow people to report on the climate change angle that comes here when you've got such a big controller of, the risk in the built environment. It's something that I don't have an answer to, but I think, in a lot of ways, hurricane and quake, they're extremely difficult perils to model. But the fact that they sort of exist in isolation often of the built environment, obviously vulnerability is something that isn't in isolation, but they exist somewhat, there before it. Precipitation isn't necessarily the peril until it's hit that flood side, right? So it's something that I haven't come to terms with yet on how best to communicate, but flood and wildfire, super interesting for trying to communicate uncertainty appropriately to non-experts when it comes to the climate change question. Yeah, very interesting one.
Just a quick point on vulnerability that Tom raised there as well. So I think we've obviously we can talk a lot about frequency and hazard, but actually I always feel like vulnerability for flooding doesn't get very much airtime and is relatively kind of unstudied. And I've thought this kind of going back to when I kind of worked in the engineering days. And I think partly that is because of some of the challenges with the frequency. You almost don't get to the kind of vulnerability stage, but certainly kind of most kind of depth damage curves and kind of vulnerability assessments are quite crude for flood. And I always feel like there's definitely an opportunity there to try and tackle some of the uncertainty as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, Rob. There's actually a question on that just now, which you've answered.
Okay.
I think so. Thanks for that. Yeah, I agree. I mean, vulnerability for any peril is always hard, right? I think, but especially so for flood. We've been doing some work on that at Fathom, of course, and Ollie published a paper on that from a multi-million plain data set in the US, I believe. Did you want to comment at all on that, Ollie? That you published on that?
Yeah, well, it's a good point, right?
Yeah.
Again, it's kind of linked to Tom's original, more philosophical point of boxing up different uncertainties, make them easier to ignore. Oh, I'll just focus on the primary uncertainty in the event set, and the rest can just sort of go by the wayside because I haven't really tackled that first one yet. But actually thinking about how you can, even if you can't accurately define the uncertainty bounds of every last component, at least trying to and sampling from it in a sensible way should be the main goal rather than fixating in the little compartmental boxes. I mean, we have to get comfortable with the idea that depth and damage are pretty loosely correlated, and yet vulnerability curves can often be a very deterministic one-to-one relationship. But it's not actually hard to look at the data, recognize there's a scatter. Sure, there's a rough trend that as depths go up, so does the damage relative to the TIV. But you need to be able to represent the fact that that uncertainty distribution is wide. In fact, complete in terms of a given flood depth could be zero loss, it could be total loss. You need to be able to sample from that, and your decisions matter when you understand the shape of that distribution and sample from it across a portfolio of locations. So yeah, I mean, of course, Rob's preaching to the choir here, but this goes far beyond just physical flood mapping, as we've been saying.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good point, Ollie and Rob. And I think, especially in cat models, if you don't represent that the uncertainty around the damage curves Ollie was talking about, what that means is what you get out in terms of the average annual loss and the standard deviation around that. The standard deviation will be far too low, right? Which means, and that is often used in pricing algorithms, mean plus factor times standard deviation is a fairly basic pricing algorithm, but it's used. And so you will be understating things like price and decisions you make based on uncertainty metrics like standard deviation if you don't have that in the damage curve. So I think it's really important. Thanks for mentioning that. So let's move on to making decisions in the light of uncertainty, which is a pretty core part of this discussion, I'd say. What sort of tools and techniques can help people sort of appreciate and understand the level of uncertainty to start with, but also then use that knowledge, that extra understanding to make better decisions? Who wants to lead? Ollie, do you want to kick us off on that?
I mean, I guess I have the luxury of never needing to make business decisions, and long may that continue. But in terms of the tools that we make available to help those unfortunate enough to have to make decisions, as a vendor, we can try and distill everything that we know into some kind of consumable product, and that is generally the long-term goal of what I and the team want to achieve. So, from a flood mapping perspective, sure, you get a single deterministic flood depth at very high precision. That's what a flood map is. But in the absence of ensemble modeling of high resolution flood inundation, which we're quite some way off the computational feasibility of that. In the meantime, you have to just appreciate that is a single snapshot amongst an enormous range of possibilities. And as Matt's alluded to, the metadata product that we've released can sort of help guide you to understand. Rob gave an example in the US where there's very high quality data. We have better knowledge of how flood defenses behave and where they're located. So you might be able to make decisions a bit more, with a bit more robustness in places like that versus somewhere where the methods underpinning the model are a little, aren't so well suited to a certain area where there's a lot of data scarcity. You can use these supplemental data sets to start essentially doing what we're talking about, which is treating uncertainty as part of the risk, not just looking at the model output and saying that's what my risk is. There's also risk in the uncertainty about the measure of the risk, and all of those things need to be folded together ultimately. When it comes to cat modeling, as we've spoken about, having everything as a distribution and sampling from it, Monte Carlo sampling should just be the bare minimum, really. We know that all of these various model components are never certain, and so if we know that, why are we presenting them as such? There's tools out there now. The Oasis loss modeling framework is, by its design, a Monte Carlo sampling framework where every component can be represented as a distribution, and that should just be the standard now. So I mean, those sorts of tools, those cat model tools, are already a purveyor of both uncertainty and modeled risk, and so we sort of already have those at our disposal to make robust decisions if they're used properly. And it sort of brings into question what we want the output of catastrophe models to be. You get your loss exceedance curve out at the end. What are the elements of uncertainty that you're comfortable as a decision maker being represented by that curve? Traditionally, it's that primary uncertainty, right? It's what event might happen next year. If it's a big one, then it's going to be low probability on my P curve, high impact. But if we fold in too many uncertainties, if we start approximating every element of these secondary uncertainties, whether it comes to flood defense uncertainty, elevation data uncertainty, true vulnerability uncertainty, not knowing much about the exposures that people are insuring, then suddenly your EP curve that comes out the model starts to be completely dominated by things that you really have no idea about. And maybe that's too far, right? Maybe you still want some event basis to be represented in your EP curve. So ultimately, you can compress uncertainty into a single line or a single number as far as you want. That's ultimately what your average annual loss is. But it's focusing on what's important. And I suspect the happy medium that at least we will land on, and hopefully our end users will tell us otherwise, is this sort of wheat sheaf of loss exceedance curves ultimately, where the curve itself is represented by something that you think you can physically model relatively well, and you have different views of what that could be. because, so you essentially have uncertainty around your 200-year loss or your average annual loss. Even though you could compress that further, I think it's still useful to keep it as a distribution. So that's the sort of long rambling answer of all the various ways you can think about uncertainty. But I think the overarching point is that data products exist right now, and really, end users just need to feel like they have the ability to mine the brains and the knowledge of the people supplying that data, and they should owe you their time in order to understand and make best use of that.
Thanks, Ollie. Tom?
Yeah, sure. I think there's also an extra layer, right, without wanting to spend too much time. But so one of the things that that led me down the path of really trying to open up uncertainty very carefully was purely going on a summer school, weirdly, at Bristol Uni, but not well, I guess it's a coincidence that it's Bristol University because it's not the Fathom team, but perhaps then it's not a coincidence, right? I'm guessing Bristol has got some sort of connection across all of this that leads to this type of thinking. But when I first joined Catlin about a decade ago, I went on a summer school at Bristol. One of the lecturers, Francesca Pianosi, had built a sensitivity analysis toolbox, and it was using that sensitivity analysis toolbox called SAFE, if anybody wants to look it up, open access in R and Python. But the methods around how to do formalized sensitivity analysis become very easily understandable through using that toolbox, and its related guides and things like Jupyter notebooks to just run through examples. But it suddenly, I think, empowers users to really think about the uncertainty that they may want to represent or capture. And I suppose that comes back to this: there's an infinite number of decisions people are trying to make all the time, and no decision is the same. So a question that would have been asked at my old company, XL, entirely different when you go to another reinsurer, even though it's in the same area, very slightly different. And so every user group has this unique way of looking at it. And I think becoming literate with toolboxes and formalized sensitivity analysis empowers people to actually go, okay, my use case is going to be through this, and I'm going to take it that way. So yeah, I would encourage anybody here on the call that has that type of thing to go and look up some of those toolboxes, because it definitely led me to be able to communicate, I think, uncertainty in a very careful way to lots of different user groups, just understanding what was available.
Great, thanks, Tom. Rob?
Yeah, I think I find what Ollie was saying around I think you described it as the uncertainty around the uncertainty is quite a good way of thinking about it. So I mean, I think cat models are very good at kind of dealing with volatility, but it's the uncertainty around that which I think sometimes they sort of struggle with, and the kind of one version of truth of what is your EP curve, what is your 200-year, which obviously is an important metric and is often tied to kind of capital requirements and regulation and things like that. But I think yeah, I certainly like the idea of, and it's been kind of talked about for a while now, but the idea of kind of weak use of EP curves, I think is definitely kind of a good way of trying to kind of represent that the variation in tail risk and the kind of different versions of the world that are out there, kind of thing. I think from an underwriting point of view, where you tend to be more concerned with kind of your AAL rather than your tail risk, then I think then kind of more simple kind of scoring measures are probably more appropriate. And I think someone mentioned a few comments back about making kind of uncertainty consumable, and I think that's definitely kind of a key thing here, is making sure that whatever you're providing is something that the recipient is able to kind of take on board and actually use. It echoes kind of a lot of Tom's points there about kind of what are the decisions being made, who is the end user, and I think there's definitely kind of a range of different decisions being made, and for that reason a range of different kind of measures of uncertainty are kind of useful.
Yeah, great, thanks. What about use of multiple models? What are people's view on that? I mean, one of the uncertainties that's really hard to evaluate is if you gave a cat modeling vendor like us or anyone if you ask them to build 10 different models, different teams, you get very different results, right? Even if you're using the same data and very similar techniques, there's an art as well as a science to building a model. And that sort of uncertainty is very large. And there was a report by Guy Carpenter, I think back in 2011, based on work by John Major and David Miller in 1999, that sort of quantified that for a national US hurricane portfolio. And it's large. You can basically take the 100-year loss, double it, halve it, and you've got about a 2/3 chance of the real number being in that. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that gives you an indication of how large it was back then. And you can argue that modelling has got better, but certainly for something like flood, there's massive uncertainty. So what's your view on use of multiple models to help with that, Ollie?
Well, the easy answer is yes, more models can help, but and you know, part of the problem with accessing multiple models is that not only do you need, you know, to access and license the data, you need to access and license a platform in order to be able to do it, and that's really what's prohibited people getting multi-model views. I think that's changing, particularly with the OASIS loss modeling framework, it being, you know, brought to life by companies like NASDAQ. That makes it so much easier to just have a consistent sole source, you know, compete on the model, not the platform, and people can start to leverage these multiple views of risk. So that's step one, and I think that's useful. But we also shouldn't kid ourselves that by having this sort of overwhelming amount of information that you necessarily will make better decisions based on it. I mean, an ensemble of rubbish models is no better than one rubbish model ultimately. So it's not a given that you're always going to make a better choice. You know, you still need to be able to be selective about, even if you can only, but I don't know, have 3 to 5 other flood models, you still need to distinguish that one of them might just be rubbish and worth discarding or weighting really low. And then what was the point in spending a load of money on licensing it ultimately? So I really think the kind of multi-vendor view of risk ultimately is a sort of poor man's placeholder for the true ensemble modeling that we need to get to. And the benefit of it is that I guess the really horrible compartmentalization of uncertainty, ontological uncertainty, which is just sort of, you know, the model builder bias, the people who built the model, have they just done it in different ways because of their background, because of their experience, and, you know, getting different views on how you should represent certain things, not all from the cat modeling world, not all from the flood modeling world, can be super useful. But when it comes to really trying to understand the uncertainty in the data that underpins the models, the uncertainty in the variability from year to year, I don't necessarily think it's a given that multiple models necessarily gives you a better view of that. You're probably much better off going with an actual ensemble of a single model to start with, if such a model exists, which of course it doesn't. But that would be my long-term view.
Thanks, Ollie. Tom, Rob, anything to add on that?
Yeah, quick one. I think yeah, Ollie's points are really good there. And I think one of the things that I've been struggling with when I'm trying to see through this, because I agree largely with Ollie. I suppose the thing that I'll always say is that multi-models should be the aspiration, right? I suppose in this, and I don't think you were not saying that, Ollie, but yeah, like I think it should be the aspiration. But yeah, to Ollie's point, it shouldn't just be blind multi-models. You know, it shouldn't just be trying to run towards let's get 10 different models in there. The thing that I'd much rather see is, okay, somebody's built I'm going to come back to hurricane because it's my natural place, but right, somebody's built a hurricane set using historical observations, and now somebody's built a hurricane set using climate model data. I'm interested to see that combination, right? Comparing 2, 3, 4 vendors that use the same underlying process to generate, you know, whether it's flood or hurricane, maybe it's not that insightful. It's more insightful to try and go, okay, what's the unique type of information that somebody else is adding, and trying and adding that to your decision process, and at least trying to get a sense of what, you know, if you started from these different ideas, where that leads you. I think that's really valuable. Structuring it in a way to actually make a meaningful decision with, though, I think we're some way away from, right? We're trying to do that at MaxInfo, trying to build decision frameworks to do it. But the reality is, I wouldn't say that's an insurance problem either, right? That exists in climate modeling, the IPCC struggle with it when they've got multi-models. So a really, really fascinating area to try and unpick, but you end up in very, very theoretical philosophy very quickly, I think. So yeah, one for people that have got a bit of time on their hands, I think.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the IPCC is a good example, right? Because almost politically, you have to have every model in there, even if you probably shouldn't. And when they all share the same bias, you're then misled into thinking that your model ensemble gives you the true uncertainty distribution. So that's kind of the word of caution, right? Is that just because you have more data points doesn't mean that you're necessarily appraising that uncertainty anymore. Flood models, right? If a flood defense was built yesterday, all of the models are not going to have that in there. So your multi-model view doesn't give you any better view of risk in that location than a single one. I think that's the point. Is it's not the panacea, of course.
Yeah, thanks. In terms of communicating uncertainty, any tips from anyone on that? I've myself been in a business where sometimes people just want a single number. You say just give me a number. Obviously, it's quite hard to encapsulate all the uncertainties we've been talking about into a single number. But sometimes a decision needs to be made, a policy needs to be written or not, and people need a single number. Have you got any advice on any tips for that sort of situation? How best to communicate uncertainty to people making decisions? Rob,
yeah. I think it depends who you're talking. We've kind of said this echoed this a few times, but I think it really depends who you're talking to. So as a kind of someone who had been on the kind of risk management side and is now more on the underwriting side, I've kind of got a bit of a lens on both sides of it. But I think certainly when we're on the cat modeling side, I think single numbers are a place to start. But I think having some kind of context around that is useful. And I think from the underwriting side, now that I'm in that kind of position, I think certainly for selecting risks, then a single number is a place to start. I'd like a bit more context around kind of multiple numbers kind of thing to understand kind of some of the range of some of the different kind of sources of uncertainty. So I think from an underwriting point of view, that's a place to start. And I think we always found that cat models tend to be cat models are great exercises in branding. So I think they've got a name against it, it's got a stamp against it. You kind of put something in, you always get the same kind of thing out. And I think underwriters tend to feel very comfortable with that. So I think we always found that actually if you try to emulate that and kind of come up with your own kind of acronym for your particular uncertainty product, then people kind of bought into that a lot more. I think when you're looking at kind of tail risk, and I think it's a different kind of conversation because the decisions that are being made are often different. And sorry, the lights are going out in a number against an EP curve is probably a bit less useful. So I think in that case, we kind of talked about weak shifts, but I think having at least kind of some idea about kind of what the bounds of your EP curve might look like is probably a good place to start. But again, I think thinking about who is it you're talking to and what do they actually want from you and what might affect what their decision ultimately is probably a good place to put yourself in as well to kind of reflect on how you want to communicate this.
Right, thanks, Rob. Tom?
I'd only echo what Rob just said there. That was a perfect summary of it, right? So don't do it until you know what you're trying to do, basically is the thing I've learned. If it could be an underwriter that says, they think they're going to write business here because they've got an idea what the risk is and they give you, a view of what they think and they haven't taken into account uncertainty. So throw all you can at them in that moment. But yeah, if somebody asks you, what do you think the uncertainty is around this, and you fundamentally know that it's huge because most things are in this world, don't give an answer until you're really clear on why they're asking you that question. So always understand the use case before communicating, basically.
Thanks, Tom. Ollie?
Nothing really to add beyond, I guess, keep bearing in mind the regulatory backdrop, right? I mean, if a regulator requires of you a misleadingly precise answer, you've got to appease them regardless of what the business decision is. So I guess the only advice there is that I guess you should still take some responsibility for the business decision, and regardless of what the regulator requires. Understand that you need to disclose whatever it is you need to disclose for your capital allocation, but really understand that the number that you're giving is ridiculously presented as a single number.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. So we're getting towards the end of our time. There are some questions I'll come to in a minute, some audience questions. If we don't get through all the audience questions, we will certainly get back to you with answers, so don't worry that your question won't be answered at some point. But before we get to the questions, just thinking of the future, what's on the horizon? What can we look forward to in terms of helping us better deal with uncertainty, or indeed helping reducing uncertainty in future? I think a few things have been mentioned, like ensemble modeling as we've been going through, but is there anything else to add to what we can look forward to in the future that can help us? Tom, why don't you start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really exciting. Just this meeting is evidence of it. But I think, to summarize it really briefly, I think that we've already mentioned it, but the collaboration that's occurring across the industry between vendors, brokers, users, and between vendors, so like the NASDAQ framework has been mentioned, but obviously NASDAQ partnering with RMS, a lot of the major vendors starting to open up, in terms of just allowing access to interrogate a lot more of their models than has been happening in the past. And I think that's coming as a result of the fact that people are being more receptive to understanding uncertainty, right? So model vendors had to protect that quite a lot, I feel, in the past, when, as you said, Matt, people might have been searching for one number. But as people are getting more and more comfortable, we're able to talk about this more openly. So I think it's happening across the board with everybody in the market. I do think, for me, one of the most exciting things is the potential for decision frameworks and a number of decision theorists being a bit more present in the market. So we've got to the point where we're able now to talk about uncertainty quite openly. But it's a question of now, how do we use the uncertainty to recollapse for decisions? And I think there's a lot of people now building things there. So that's something that for me is really exciting on the horizon. And then the bigger thing is just there's clearly this massively open dialogue now between academia and industry. And I think that the more I go to a lot of the academic meetings now, the less frustrated people are when you start talking about what the CAT models are doing and why. And it's because we can start actually being able to communicate a lot of this uncertainty. And it's obviously where the academics can see that too. So there's a lot of a bridge being built, I feel, because of it. So I guess the summary of all of those exciting things on the horizon is Matt, it's the removal of that concern you had back in the day. I don't think that give me one number, give me that best estimate and move on. I don't think it exists anymore. I think people are really, really able to dig into it. So that's the most exciting thing for me.
Great, thanks, Tom. Rob?
I think it's interesting to see now. I think people at a senior level maybe not embracing uncertainty, but maybe they're more open to kind of discussing the relativities of uncertainty between different perils or different regions, and using that to kind of inform their decisions. And I think that's a great starting point. I think it'd be interesting to see over the coming years how if regulators and regulations kind of start to embrace uncertainty, and whether there's a kind of a downward kind of filter of kind of being forced to look at uncertainty, which is certainly, I think, in the past helped to open up some CAT model vendors in terms of kind of their willingness to share data on kind of uncertainties, that people can form their own views of risk and things like that. So it'd be interesting to see if there's any kind of further direction there.
Thanks, Rob. Ollie?
Yeah, I think on the kind of framework side of things, the eventual removal of the fear of uncertainty is going to be quite an exciting sort of watershed moment for the industry. Ultimately, we're in a position where the standard deviation is many times bigger than the mean, and we're still only looking at the mean. But I don't think that's going to persist for much longer, even if it does at all now. And really almost fessing up to what these models are good for, which is more defining where the EP curve is not, rather than where it actually is. And a whole, plethora of use cases can spring off the back of that. On more specific notes, how we go about reducing uncertainty moving forwards. I mean, there's of course an argument that understanding and quantifying uncertainty is itself an uncertainty reducing thing to do. But if we're talking about better models equals reduced uncertainty, I mean, just in the flood space, there's all sorts of things on the horizon, and increased proliferation of LiDAR elevation data very much reduces uncertainty, probably reduces a bias. The Surface Water Ocean Topography mission, which is a new NASA satellite mission, will enable us to better quantify uncertainty by validating models, will enable us to better understand the conveyance of water in river channels and things like that, which is itself a bias correcting measure in these models, ensuring that the channels are fit for the flows that you're putting down them. So there's all sorts of very specific stuff and all sorts of very general stuff, but I certainly get the sense we're moving in the right direction.
Can I add a really quick one, Matt? Sorry on that, because it's a real bugbear of mine. But one thing that I do find is sort of a often misunderstood thing is that as science improves, there's an assumption with a lot of people that uncertainty will decrease, and it's often not the case. It's often the opposite. As our understanding of the system increases, our uncertainty about it increases because we've just misunderstood epistemic. I'm not going to say that word. We've misunderstood uncertainty. So yeah, it's a really interesting one, but we shouldn't shy away from it. Yeah,
that is interesting. Thanks a lot for that, Tom. We're out of time pretty much now. We've answered a number of questions as we've gone through, actually, just looking at the questions. So we have answered a number. The few that are outstanding, we will get back to you with answers on those after the webinar. But I just invite any closing comments now, short closing comments, please, and then I'll wrap up. Why don't we start with you, Rob? Any final thoughts?
No, just it's great to be part of this event, and it got my brain thinking beforehand and during the event. So I think that's a good thing for tackling uncertainty. Fantastic, thanks. Well, thanks for being on the panel, Tom.
No, let's just make the world more uncertain, please, and then let's see what we can do.
How about you, Ollie? Final words?
Yeah, I think I've done my close. I guess the overarching point is, please don't prepare yourself for a world in which we reduce uncertainty to zero, because it will never, ever, ever happen. So don't be waiting on that. Learn to appraise it better.
Fantastic. Well, that brings us to the end of our time, pretty much. So I'd like to say a huge thanks to all of you. Thanks for giving us such insight. It's an extremely important and relevant topic, obviously. I think that's become clear. I'd like to thank everyone that's watched us over the last hour. I hope it's been useful. I think it should have been useful. I think what has come through this, if you're genuinely interested in better understanding uncertainty and come to terms with the uncertainty, the tools are arriving now. We mentioned metadata. Tom's actually, he hasn't mentioned it, it's been very humble, but he's launching a new tool called Magnify at the REA conference next week. It helps automate cat model evaluations, uncover decision relevant uncertainty. So that's something. We've mentioned multiple models, Oasis, NASDAQ, the intelligent risk platform, Swiss Re, CatNet. These are all platforms that can serve up multiple views of risk or maps. So you can actually choose to be more informed now, I think is a takeaway. You can take action that means you can make better decisions in the light of all this uncertainty, and certainly being part of this webinar, I hope is part of that. One of the things to mention again, metadata product briefing on March the 7th. Click on the link and do sign up for that, please. Tom and myself will be at the REA conference next week. So if you're there, please do come over and say hello. Be sure to visit Tom's stand. He'll be launching and demonstrating his new Magnify product. And a number of us will be at the London Cat Risk Management Conference in March, including Marek Schaefer from VAVE, who'll be speaking on data science in cat risk modelling. Ollie will actually be on a panel there, talking about how to incorporate climate change projections into flood cat models. And Jeff Neal and James Savage from Fathom will be doing a roundtable session on how to distinguish claims of credibility, peer review, validation, and academic authority within flood modelling. So please do join us there. And with that, we'll close the webinar. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.